Hello, all. Okay, I have to apologize for appearances. We are having grass grow all over the place. I have to mow every other day, and it's crazy. So you're gonna have to excuse my appearance here. Um, but I just had to do this video. First of all, you get these Nancy boys on YouTube, and they have these so-called community guidelines where if you're a little bit critical, they just get very sensitive and it hurts their feelings. But the amount of stupidity and ignorance that has to be addressed sometimes warrants hurting people's feelings, okay? I am sick of the stupidity, okay? When it comes to martial arts, when it comes to understanding the role of forms in the older systems, particularly, this notion that are they really necessary? Yada, yada. So I'm going to go explain a few things here. And if I hurt anybody's feelings, well, nobody watches my videos yet anyway. But when they do come out eventually, if I hurt anybody's feelings, too bad. It's ridiculous. Okay, let's talk about documented arts that have seen combat. We're talking almost exclusively Koryu, Japanese arts. Okay, documented since people did things on the battlefield. Always people make assumptions that in this day and age, things don't apply. It's the same stupidity that says, for example, philosophy is a Western pedigree coming from the Greeks. When, if you look at India, India had a incredibly complex philosophical tradition predating anything the Greeks did, okay? With all the same basic concepts in schools, plus at least twice as many more, okay? So it's not simple and misguided. It's the same mentality that says when Plato writes historically about talking to certain people in Greek society that it must be a myth because back then they didn't really understand what real history was. Get rid of all the chauvinism, folks, and face reality. When you look at Koryu forms, here is the purpose, okay? When you're in combat and you're in stressed situations, a couple of things apply. First of all, you're limited in your movement because you undergo certain physiological changes. Any training you do in smaller complex movements has to be very, very carefully done and refined because your body moves and perceives a certain way under stress, okay? Under adrenal load, etc. When you're on a battlefield, the same thing applies. You cannot do a lot of very complicated movements throwing things around because you may be fighting all day. You may not have access to water or food or medical, okay? It's reflected in your approach, okay? Koryu forms teach whole body movements that habitually are reflexively done so you will not do something that will get you killed. That's their purpose, okay? With weapons, without weapons, the same things apply. If you make a mistake and you're in armor and you get on the ground, somebody will simply lift your helmet and cut your throat. You don't have the luxury, okay, of doing a very complicated type of a Kimura or question mark throw or what have you, okay? Now, does that still apply today? Absolutely, because here's the thing nobody understands. You can take those movements and develop them into anything that you want. You can add different footwork, angles, timing, distancing. But in order to have a tradition that can be passed on, you need a physical textbook and you need to be able to teach things that enable people to be successful when they are building their own approach. Koryu was never meant to be a dead, empty form. And this is what I love about Hatsumi. Whatever anybody says about him, he brings those things alive. Does he do things a little bit silly sometimes? Does he go a little too far? Sure. But he shows what that looks like when you live in these forms, okay? So you may practice something with a very deep command. You're working on your intent. You may practice with a certain distance because of the weapons you're using. And then when you're doing hinka, variations of that, it may look very different, okay? I'm using Bujinkan, but I'm not a Bujinkan student. I studied the Bujinkan for many years, probably about 15, all said and done. I studied many other arts for long periods of time, and the same applies, okay? So when people say things like, why do you need the basics? Let me explain something else to you. When you start teaching this stuff, and if you don't start having a reference point, you're going to start talking past each other like people do on YouTube, okay? People don't even know what they're referring to. So, for example, somebody's talking about the qualities of movement, and they're talking about whole body movements, and they're talking about taijutsu. Somebody else is talking about taijutsu as the Moromochi period, Warring States period, pre-Edo period system of Japanese combat, okay? They're specifically talking about something coming from that era and techniques coming from traditions of that era. Two different things. People don't know that, okay? People don't know things like when you deal with whole body movements, they tend to be universal. They don't necessarily consider proportion, length of reach, okay, different build, etc. Whereas when you start talking about Tai Sabaki, body movements, okay, that are more particular, where you're moving one part of the body out of sequence with another, okay, or when you're talking about footwork, Ashi Sabaki, it's very important the difference in how somebody is built compared to somebody else, okay? So then people talk about you can use a stick just as good as if you don't study the basics. That may be true. However, what you don't understand is that when you're in a situation, your heart is pumping, your legs feel like they won't move for you, okay? And you can't really talk properly because you're not used to that adrenal load, and you have to use that weapon. You will be prone to do all kinds of things that are intuitive that will get you killed, okay? Because in that state, in that type of movement, if you don't understand those basics, okay, you won't understand what it really takes to work with something in that situation because it's very different, okay? You have to overcome resistance and be in on your opponent. If you look at most of the Koryu, okay, a lot of them have small weapons in there. Why do they have small weapons? This was before people got into duels and tea houses, okay? We're not talking Edo period Japan, okay? They did it because when you close distance, those are the weapons you use, okay? And you have to close distance, okay? When you're teaching people skills, the least trained, you give the most length. You give the nice long pikes to the soldiers who are the least able because they have that advantage with length. I know if I have 20 men in a company, okay, and 10 of them are not particularly skilled, 10 of them are pretty good, we'll keep it simple, okay, I'm going to give the 10 that are not so skilled the ability to work against the swordsman by giving them a longer weapon, okay? Now, the problem with that is that they can't really close and finish off their opponent, okay? So, look at something like Takanouchi Ryu. A lot of the work done is with, they don't call it the wakizashi, but the small dagger, kodachi, okay? A lot of it. Now, again, why is that? People never want to look at that. They just want to make pronouncements, okay? Them samurais back then, they used to like kick people off of horses. We don't do that here at Cooter's Kung Fu School. That kind of attitude. And you know what? It's ridiculous, okay? Let me break it down to you guys, okay? And I'll make this extremely clear. You have to pressure test things. If you haven't had that experience as a younger person, that's fine. Maybe you can't at this point do that. But the next level up is understand different states of perception based on situation, okay? And then understand that The people that designed arts for combat were extremely aware of this. People were not more gentle back then. They were not more cutthroat. They were a lot tougher. They were, okay? But they understood how things worked, okay? And that's what you're working with when you work with basics. It is a very good exercise to go through and do things with big, strong movements and then gradually learning to cut them down and work with them on a level where you can make that part of your repertoire. But don't forget about those techniques and where they come from when you are presenting them. Do not disregard or belittle, okay? Combat, everybody thinks the end all and be all of combat is going to the local bar and being able to punch a drunk in the face these days, or getting into a street fight. That's not, okay? I was a bouncer for years, okay? And I can tell you, first of all, the amount of people that actually utilize any sort of actual technique in those situations never really happens, because people who understand how to fight avoid those techniques by and large. And when they do, are in that situation, they overcome the initial resistance and understanding to know when you strike somebody when they're most vulnerable. And it isn't when, you're squared up on the street looking at each other and screaming, okay? If you're in that situation, you've already fucked up a little bit. Doesn't mean you can't deal with it, but you've already let it get farther than it should, okay? And I'll tell you right now, people will have this attitude, well, you can go to jail for that. Well, you know what? You can also get killed by somebody in a street fight because you didn't act. And that's your choice. I'm 62 years old. I've raised two young boys who are very successful. I have a beautiful wife who's successful and two dogs that I love as much as every member of my family. If I have to go to prison the rest of my life because somebody fucked with me, so be it. I'm not looking for it, and I've managed to avoid it. And I've been into some real bad situations, and I haven't killed anybody, okay? But, pick your poison, Anyway, I hope this is somewhat helpful. I know it's a bit of a rant.